Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus Law Review, our weekly weekend review, our analysis, our assessment of our deliberation on all things related to courts, the rule of law, the administration of justice in Wisconsin, throughout the United States of America, and on the face of our planet. My name is Jim Santelle. I am your host here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media here in Wisconsin and in other venues throughout the United States of America. Delighted and honored to have you with me for hopefully both hours this weekend of our broadcast, coming to you from the broadcast stations of Civic Media, joined in the broadcast station of Civic Media by my terrific producer, Max. And together today we are inviting you into our conversation, as we always do every single weekend here on Amicus Law Review. You can be a part of our conversation by sending to me, sending to Max, your questions, your inquiries about those things that are on our always ambitious but achievable syllabus, our academic agenda for this weekend. You can do that by calling, texting at 855-752-4842. That number once again, 855-752-4842. Be a part of our discussion, be a part of our engagement on these important issues affecting our lives, our livelihoods here in the United States of America. What is our syllabus all about this weekend? Lots and lots of things, but especially focusing upon the rule of law, justice ideas, concepts related to courts, and the administration of justice, both with a small j and a capital J, having to do with the Department of Justice. Yes, that's right. We're going to spend a lot of time this weekend talking, as we have before, but not in this detail, about the United States Department of Justice. Give us some sense of the history. Where does it come from? How did the Congress, the very first Congress, create the office of the Attorney General? When did that happen? What was the commission to the Attorney General at that time? We have had 86 attorneys general, and yes, that's how you pronounce the plural of them. It's attorneys general. 86 since the time of the initial attorney general being sworn in under the administration of President George Washington. We've had 86 of them, and all of them are taking their commission from this initial statement, this initial legislative enactment by our Congress, creating the office of the Attorney General. About 100 years later, that a Department of Justice would be formally established by the Congress. We're going to spend some time talking about what attorneys general do, talk about what a deputy attorney general does, what the associate attorney general does, what the solicitor general does, and more broadly about the structure of the organization, the format, the mission of the Department of Justice. Why? You know why. You know why well, because just this past week, the president-elect, incoming President Donald John Trump, has begun to announce that people are going to be filling those top positions in the United States Department of Justice. He has announced, although not yet confirmed, obviously the Senate does that, if at all. He has announced his appointment, his nominee for the position of Attorney General, the chief federal law enforcement officer in our nation. He's also announced, significantly, we're going to spend some time talking about this as well, some of the other major posts inside the Department of Justice: Deputy Attorney General, and yes, Solicitor General of the United States of America. We'll talk more about exactly what those posts do. We'll spend some time reviewing the overall function, again, the structure, the many myriad things that are incorporated inside and under the direction of the Attorney General, not just lawyers, not just people in court representing you, the people of America, in the federal district courts and appellate courts of our land, in the Supreme Court, not just criminal prosecutors, civil litigators, assistant U.S. attorneys, trial lawyers at the Department of Justice, but also a great number of other people inside the Department of Justice, all civil servants as well, with the exception of those top-level appointed positions. People who do things like investigate crime will spend some time talking about the many federal agencies that are inside the Department of Justice. It is not the case that the FBI is a separate stand-alone entity. The FBI is a part of the Department of Justice, as are several other agencies, and then a great number of other offices that do things like provide funding and support for our various institutions locally and county levels and state levels, support law enforcement, support a whole variety of things. But the Congress has said the Department of Justice should be engaged in beyond just the courts. What is the role of the Department of Justice in the community? It is to support you. It is to serve you in all those various areas. We're going to talk about the history of that. We'll talk about the present status of that as we begin to understand the appointments that the president, the incoming president of the United States of America, hopes to make, hopes to confirm, presumably in the weeks, maybe the months ahead, in filling the people who are going to be leading our Department of Justice. Some graphic commentary, as you can well imagine, about not only his nominee for the Attorney General position, the Chief Federal Law Enforcement position in our nation, but also about these other positions. We're going to spend some time talking about the propriety, the impropriety, the appropriateness, the lack of appropriateness in the apparent decision by the incoming president, Donald Trump, to appoint to these positions his own private defense counsel. The attorneys who've been representing him in these criminal cases, representing him before the Supreme Court, good attorneys, plainly successful in doing what they've been doing. I'm going to talk about who they are, where they come from, and then a little bit of commentary. Three things that I've identified that give me pause when it comes to a president-elect nominating people who are right now representing him in a personal and private capacity. Inviting, of course, on this broadcast, your comments, your inquiries, your opposition to my positions. That's what this broadcast is all about. Inviting that conversation once again at 855-752-4842. Also dropping a line to us in the Civic Media app about any of those issues, spending the lion's share of our time this weekend talking about the United States Department of Justice, the positions inside it, and then in our second hour, a bit of update on the United States Supreme Court, also much related to the Department of Justice, including the connection to the Solicitor General of the United States of America. And then finally, a bit about the status of those cases pending against Donald Trump. 4 of them to this day, to this hour, still pending against the incoming president of the United States of America. 2 criminal cases in the state system, 2 criminal cases in the federal system still in place as of this time. We're going to talk about the status of those. And that also begins the first portion of our discussion of Amicus, a law review on the broadcast stations of Civic Media, beginning with some commission that's going to be relevant not only to our entire discussion this morning about the Department of Justice, what it should be doing now, what it should be doing in the future, but also what you should be doing in the wake of the election of our next president, my next president, your next president, Donald Trump, to occupy that chief executive position, something that is a part of our national understanding, but the importance of this particular instruction coming from a fellow named Timothy Snyder. Timothy Snyder, you may recall, that he wrote a book called On Tyranny. Not to predict necessarily that we're going to be in a tyrannical state, but certainly great concerns about the future of America as, among other things, we see the nature and the quality of the people that Donald Trump is putting in place or hopes to put in place in various positions. Timothy Snyder writing a book called On Tyranny. It's been out there for a long period of time. He is a professor of history at Yale University, written a number of books, and has been a member of the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a permanent fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. In addition to all of his academic accomplishments, has also written this piece, 20 lessons from, he says, the 20th century, also applicable to the 21st century. And here is rule number 1 that Timothy Snyder advocates for, that promotes to us when it comes to traditional and transitional periods of time, from tradition to perhaps what is going to be a non-traditional administration. He says this: do not obey in advance. Rule number 1, do not obey in advance. Here's what he writes about that. based upon commentary, some history that he provides. Says most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given, he says. In times like these, again, he was not imagining at the time that he wrote this, that we would have this particular situation in 2024, 2025. But he says in times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government may or will want. And then they offer themselves without being asked. Let me repeat that. In times like these, he says, individuals think about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. His final introductory statement in support of this rule, do not obey in advance, is this: a citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. A citizen who adapts in this way, anticipating a more repressive, a change in government, teaches power what it can, and I would add what it cannot do. But what it can do, of course, is appoint people to positions of responsibility, can define the policies, the practices, not only of the U.S. Department of Justice, but also of all the other agencies, can direct the focus and the purpose of our nation. For at least 4 years, through all of the mechanisms of the executive branch. We'll be talking about that plainly in the weekends ahead, throughout the weeks just ahead, in anticipation of the inauguration of Donald Trump on January 20th. But beyond that, as his administration comes to place, thinking about this time right now, the days before the administration goes into effect, this notion of ceding power to an administration not yet in place. It's going to animate a lot of my commentary, which you heard also last weekend, about what the Department of Justice should and should not do when it comes to these pending two federal cases, plainly never going to see the light of day, but nonetheless moving in the direction of dismissal. The question is, who does that? How do those cases go away? Advocacy here again this morning at the end of our second hour for the notion that those cases should remain in place until, if ever, Donald Trump and his new Department of Justice chooses to abandon them. We're going to spend some time also talking about the Solicitor General in our second segment, not only because of the importance of that position, but because we also recognize and we observed recently the death of a very significant incumbent of that office. His name is Ted Olson. We're going to chat about the legacy of Ted Olson, the lessons that Ted Olson during his lifetime and even in his death provide to us here on Amicus, a law review. All right. Oh, good.
We're going into first.
Yeah. So we're going to do. It's actually not in my agenda. We're going to do a Ted Olson piece.
Okay.
And then I'm going to get into most of today is going to be Department of Justice stuff, and so it's going to pretty much follow this. We're going to do a little piece on Ted Olson, and then get into that.
Okay.
We'll do SCOTUS at the end of the second hour, probably, and some more of the cases if we have time at the end of that. So that's the plan. Yep. See, Mark is online. Right? I'm not going to take him anytime soon, so he can sit there if he wants to, but it'll be a while. So all right.
Remember, we're on 10 o'clock. So
okay, so we come back at 21.
No, 20.
At 20. Okay, we're that's right. We're still on the so it's
20 and 50.
okay. So we're on the weekend schedule.
Yep.
Okay, got it. Good. All right.
15 seconds.
Good. Thank you. This is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle. I am your host this hour and also next hour here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media, as always encouraging your involvement in our discussion. Mostly today, principally today, and in the future as well, focusing upon the United States Department of Justice, talking about what these various positions inside the structure the organizational chart of the Department of Justice, what does that say? What does it contemplate about what these people do? Why is it so significant for Americans to be focused, as we should, every single administration, whenever these people change? Who is the president nominating for these major positions inside the department? What do they do, and why are they going to affect what you do in America? And we begin with a bit of an informal, probably incomplete obituary for one of the people who encumbered one of those important positions of the past. His name is Ted Olson. He was born on September 11th, 1940. He died on November 13th, just a few days ago. He occupied the position. He was the 42nd Solicitor General of the United States of America. So important that we think about Ted Olson and what a Solicitor General does here on Amicus Law Review this weekend. The former Solicitor General during the George W. Bush administration from 2001 to 2004. We revisit this as we talk more about the current president's likely nominee to occupy this position in his administration. But the Solicitor General is that person. We've talked about that person a lot. Elizabeth Proligar is the present Solicitor General. What does the Solicitor General do? That's the person. This is the individual, the lawyer inside the Department of Justice, typically viewed as being about fourth in command, who argues cases before the Supreme Court. You see Ms. Proligar on a regular basis presenting cases to the Supreme Court, defending the government, defending the policies of the administration, also defending your interests and advocating for your interests. She is the people's lawyer. And that's why this position is no small thing. It's very important that the Solicitor General not only have experience, as did Ted Olson, as does the present nominee by Donald Trump to occupy this position, doing this, arguing cases before the Supreme Court. They're the ones who come up with the briefs. They write those memorandums to the Supreme Court explaining what it is the government, the Department of Justice, what it is that the government right now is advocating for when it comes to all kinds of things. We've seen voting rights, we've seen civil rights, housing issues, academic issues, environmental issues, immigration, commerce, labor, agriculture, you name it, it is out there. And that is reflected in many of our reviews of what the Supreme Court does every single term. In any case involving the government, an awful lot of cases involving non-government parties and interests. But in any case involving the government, the Solicitor General is there. And that's why this position is so very important. Ted Olson occupying that position from 2001 to 2004. Before that, in the Reagan administration, he was an Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. What do they do? That's the branch inside the Department of Justice that creates all kinds of policies and practices, among other things also relevant to our discussion in recent times. The Office of Legal Counsel, they're the ones who came up with this policy that you do not prosecute a sitting president. Remember this when it comes to both the Mueller investigation and right now animating the present Attorney General and Special Counsel not to go ahead with the present cases against Donald Trump because he's going to be a future president. We'll talk more about the merits of that. The Legal Counsel Office develops policy and practice about how the Department of Justice, how 93 U.S. attorneys around the country, how those offices operate in the public domain. You should know that Ted Olson had also a very important and storied and significant career in the practice law. He was a partner for many years in and out at a major law firm called Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. He also argued in 2000 the case of Bush versus Gore on behalf of George Bush, successful obviously in convincing the Supreme Court then in changing once again the history of America, finding that in the state of Florida the votes should be stopped. No more counting of those votes in the state of Florida. He argued Bush versus Gore successfully on behalf of then candidate, then arguably successful nominee candidate for the presidency of the United States of America, George W. Bush. In later years, even as a conservative lawyer, no doubt about it, in his views throughout his career, he was a strong advocate for marriage equality. A very strong advocate. Said, you know what? Marriage is marriage. Marriage is an important concept for people of all political backgrounds, left, right, in between, and we should support this regardless of who it is who joins in that marriage equality pact. A significant thing for Ted Olson to say. He argued 12 cases before the United States Supreme Court. before becoming the Solicitor General. Lots of experience, which of course is what you want in a nominee, in a person who encumbers that position. It is also significant to note that he also represented Tom Brady, among many other clients, in the Deflategate scandal. Remember that? And it represented him. He decided in the end not to appeal that decision of a 4-game suspension, many other important representations. He represented the DACA recipients in a major Supreme Court case in 2019, a case of Department of Homeland Security versus Regents of the University of California. Supreme Court ultimately upholding that program upon the failure of the Trump administration to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. Ted Olson argued that in support of the DACA recipients. Again, you might not think a conservative lawyer, a conservative would do that, but shows, again, that the lines that we sometimes draw, the descriptions we sometimes provide are not always indicative of people who bring to these issues their independent thought. Ted Olson among those. Significantly, Ted Olson in March of 2018 specifically decided not to represent Donald Trump in that Russian probe, sometimes called the Mueller investigation, into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Told Donald Trump, nope, I'm not doing that. Went on again to do many other things in his own career. And significantly, Ted Olson also had a tragedy in his life. We all have many tragedies. He had one that was notable. Ted Olson was married 4 times. And his third wife died in a plane crash on 9/11. Yes, that's right. Died in Flight 77. That's the flight that went into the Pentagon. Lost his wife on September 11th as that plane crashed into the Pentagon. Married 4 times, a major person in the history of America, Solicitor General of the United States of America, advocate for civil rights, advocate for things that we agree with, don't agree with. He was the kind of person that we want in these positions, because even though he is a conservative by his own description, not someone who's going to be pigeonholed into that view, and he views the law as something that should be invoked to promote and to advance the interests of justice generally. We observe today the life of Ted Olson, former Solicitor General, the 42nd Solicitor General, as we think today about the United States Department of Justice and what a Solicitor General does, what an Attorney General does, what a Deputy Attorney General does, and what all of them do, what all these people do inside the Department of Justice that Donald Trump has said he is now going to populate with people according to his inclination, which every president has the capacity to do. We know that presidents are required to, under the Constitution, nominate the people they want to occupy these various spots, not just inside the Department of Justice, but throughout government, confirmed, if at all, by the Senate. And as we continue our discussion, we'll talk more about where the Attorney General fits in all of this, where the Department of Justice fits as Amicus. The Law Review continues.
This is Amicus Law Review. My name is Jim Santelle, your host this hour and next hour as we take up some of the major news of this past week, and that is the articulated intention of the president-elect. His name is Donald Trump. He is going to be our next president as of January 20th of 2025. He is beginning to populate the people, the positions around his cabinet table, and that includes the Attorney General of the United States of America, the chief federal law enforcement officer. You know the news well. It has been all over, and that is his decision. That is Donald Trump's decision to nominate Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz, the now former congressman, member of the House of Representatives from Florida, Matt Gaetz, to serve as our chief federal law enforcement officer in the incoming administration of Donald Trump. Lots of things to talk about whether or not that will happen. But the intention right now of the president-elect is to present that name, maybe, to the United States Senate, depending upon what the president also does with this threat, this statement that he'd like the Senate to go in recess so he can appoint, presumably, the Attorney General, maybe other people, on a lot of issues there related to the process. But the name of Matt Gaetz being placed in process to become our next Attorney General. We'll talk about the merits and demerits of that. And then also the president, late this past week, announcing the names of other people, the Deputy Attorney General, announcing that Todd Blanche, a lawyer who oversaw his defense in at least 3 of those criminal cases, continues to represent him in those cases for the number 2 position at the Department of Justice, the person who's responsible for the administration, the actual conduct, the day-to-day operation of the Department of Justice. That announcement also made by the president. A couple of other nominations for the position of what's called Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General, sort of like this chief of staff for the deputy, a hugely important position, chief of staff to that person's second in command. Also, another attorney representing Donald Trump at the criminal defense tables in this country. His name is Emil, E-M-I-L, Bove, B-O-V-E. That announcement also made. And then also in connection with a lot of our focus on the Solicitor General Office, this person who argues cases to the Supreme Court on behalf of the department, on behalf of the administration, on behalf of the people of the country, announcing that D. John Sauer, S-A-U-E-R, will be the nominee for the Solicitor General position. We'll talk about where those folks come from. Mr. Sauer, also a legal representative who has as his client in the past and to recent times Donald Trump in private proceedings and also other matters. We'll talk about all of that following our discussion about what is important in these areas. Why should we care about who is encumbering the positions of Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, Solicitor General, many other spots, Assistant Attorneys General, the directors of various offices inside the Department of Justice, all these people that the president needs to and is going to nominate and presumably at one point appoint for encumbering these offices. Why are these things important? Let's begin with some history. The history of our nation is that the Department of Justice traces its beginnings to the very first Congress. That's right, the very first Congress meeting in New York, not in Washington, 1789. Congress, as you may recall from history, devoted itself in many ways to creating the infrastructure for the operation of the federal government. The Constitution provides the broad structures for that. The legislature gets together, the House and the Senate, and they begin to define what all of that means. After meeting for several months, again, New York City, 1789, the Judiciary Act of that year provides for the organization and administration of the judicial branch, courts, creating federal courts around the country. That's one portion of the federal government. And also included in that act, a provision for the appointment of, and here's the quote, a meet, M-E-E-T, keep that word in mind, a meet person learned in the law to act as Attorney General for the United States of America. What does the word meet mean? Well, as it was understood then, and it still has a partial definition today, it means someone who's selfless, someone who thinks about other people, someone who's not self-focused, whose interests in life are beyond themselves, and who's concerned about all of us, who looks to other people and says, what can I do for you? How can I serve you? How can I support you in your own personal and public lives. That's a meat person thinking beyond themselves, a public servant, quite literally, a meat person learned in the law to act as Attorney General for the United States of America. It would be about another century or so where the Congress would get around to actually creating a formal Department of Justice, putting people around that Attorney General in the way that we think about it today. The department itself not created for about another 100 years or so. But it's clear to say that the Attorney General, that creation in 1789, that's where we trace things back. The Judiciary Act passed by Congress, signed by President George Washington on September 24th, 1789, making the Attorney General the fourth person in order of creation by the Congress in those positions that have come to be defined by the cabinet level positions. What do we know about the Attorney General to this day? Well, we know, from among other things, again, fourth in line, generally regarded again as among the top positions in any president's cabinet, along with others in those cabinet positions. We know that the Attorney General to this day, because of all sorts of other legislation passed by the Congress, the Attorney General is seventh in line for succession to the presidency in case all of the others in advance of the first six in advance of the Attorney General are no longer available. Seventh in line, not too far from the White House itself. We know that the present Attorney General is the 86th. 86. We've had 86 of them. 86 attorneys general since the early parts of our nation's history. Merrick Garland occupying that position. He was nominated by Joe Biden, confirmed by a Senate back in 2021, and began his incumbency on March 11th of 2021. He remains our Attorney General to this day, as you well know. He's got responsibility for overseeing this agency that includes lawyers, includes agents, includes investigators, includes policymakers, includes an awful lot of people who define what the Department of Justice is all about these days. And on November 14th, just a few days ago, President-elect Donald Trump nominated Republican Congressman, former Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz, to be his Attorney General during his second term, Donald Trump's second term in office. In addition to that order of 1789, that act of 1789 coming from the Congress, the legislation also contemplated that the Attorney General would be someone who would give advice and opinion on questions of law when required by other branches of government, other departments that may be out there, including the President of the United States of America. Now, some of those delegations, some of those responsibilities from 1789 have subsequently been sent off in other directions. Some of those now placed in the position of the Solicitor General of the United States of America, also inside the department, and also something that should be differentiated. White House counsel. The president has also indicated who he's going to appoint, who he's going to put in that position inside the White House to serve as his attorney, not in a private capacity, but giving him advice and counsel in a government official capacity on behalf of the presidency, the executive branch. That's not the role of the Attorney General. The Attorney General, although plainly a member of the cabinet, plainly taking direction on broad issues of law enforcement from the president, is not the president's private attorney, is not the president's personal counsel, is not the person who provides individual, independent, direct advice to the president about how he should conduct himself. That now could be a truly private attorney outside of the White House, but more closely aligned with the White House counsel on matters of government affairs. The Attorney General is your representative. He represents the people of the United States of America, appointed by a president and with connections to the president, but nonetheless someone who has, as I've often said, that arm's length relationship to the presidency. Why is that good? Why is that all important? And why is it important as we think about the people that Donald Trump is appointing now, nominating now for these positions? Because you want, regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of who you voted for, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, someone else, it is a good and right thing, and it has been the tradition, for the most part, for presidents to have an arm's length relationship with the Attorney General. Why? You don't want a president, any president, including the present president, including past presidents, future presidents, dictating to the Department of Justice how
government should work when it comes to prosecuting individuals, litigating in the civil arena specific cases. A president can and should define generally the kinds of things that he, one day she, may envision for the department. I want my attorney general to focus on antitrust matters, corporate matters, environmental matters, civil rights matters, housing issues, voting issues, all kinds of things, immigration issues. Those broad commissions can, and in fact, are made from a president to an attorney general. But what the president does not do is say, I want you to prosecute this individual. I want you to sue these people. I want you to go after these particular people. That's what the president does not do. Now, it's not in the Constitution, but it's implicit, if not explicit, in something called the Federalist Papers, that you want that separation of powers because you want independent decision-making inside the Department of Justice, beginning at the Attorney General, including the Associate Attorney General, including all of the Assistant Attorneys General responsible for all kinds of things in those areas, including tax and civil issues and civil rights issues and criminal issues and antitrust issues and environmental issues, all those people exercising independent authority of the White House when it comes to who in particular should be brought into court. That's the differentiation. That's what you don't want a president doing, dictating who it is the Department of Justice should indict, dictating who it is the Department of Justice should litigate against in enforcing the laws. And that ultimately is the position. That's obviously the focus of the Department of Justice. That is why the statements by candidate President Donald Trump, articulating this view that he is going to use his Department of Justice to erase that arm's length position and to go after my political rivals, as he has said. He has identified some of them. He's identified the Bidens, the Obamas. He's identified other people, the Clintons, other people who have, according to him, been in his eyesight as his rivals. That is precisely what you don't want a Department of Justice to do. That's precisely what is contrary to the tradition of this country ever since an attorney general was first appointed way back by George Washington in 1789, not dictating to that first attorney general what it is he should be doing. And that has been my experience as well. I worked under 7 different attorneys general in my 30 years with the U.S. Department of Justice, worked very closely with 2 of them, Janet Reno, when I was at Maine Justice for the 8 years that she was the attorney general. I was there for a couple of them. Also worked directly for Eric Holder when he became the attorney general. He was my direct boss when I was the United States attorney. But I worked for 7 other attorneys general, including the time that I was in Iraq. Worked for John Ashcroft, worked for Alberto Gonzalez, Michael Mukasey, all sorts of attorneys general out there during my time as an assistant United States attorney. And never during that period of time, even as United States attorney, did I ever get a phone call? Did I ever get any direction from a president telling me how to prosecute cases, telling me who should be indicted, who should be litigated, who should be named in civil litigation? The attorney general can become involved in that, but not the president. You don't want the president dictating who it is who's on the receiving end of a civil complaint, a criminal indictment returned by a grand jury. That's where the line is drawn. And that's the concern. And that's why these positions, as Donald Trump is naming them, are so very important. He has indicated that he is going to erase that tradition, that arm's length status that has been a part of our history will no longer be in place. Let's talk more about what the Attorney General does and the significance of this when it comes to those appointments. The Attorney General playing at the top of the list. If you go online, you can pull up what is on the surface of it, a boring organizational chart issued by Merrick Garland at the start of this term. I would offer to you that you should take a look at it because it not only reflects the importance of how this administration is working, how it is structured, but how it will do it in the future with some small changes. Most attorneys general organize the department around these rules and structures. When we come back, we'll talk about how that structure contemplates a deputy attorney general, assistant attorneys general, and others operating inside the present administration and also future administrations. Here on Amicus, a law review.
is Amicus, a law review, talking this weekend all about the news of Donald Trump, the president-elect, announcing who he's going to nominate for the various positions in the leadership roles at the United States Department of Justice. At the top of that list, of course, the Attorney General, going to be Matt Gaetz if the United States Senate confirms him as that position. Contemplates the Attorney General, again, in charge of thousands of people nationwide, not just in Washington, D.C., not just on 9th and Constitution there, responsible for a great variety of matters in court, out of court, a huge responsibility when it comes to administering this huge agency that has grown up a lot since 1789, has responding to him a deputy attorney general. The deputy attorney general, again, identified by the incoming president. His nominee is going to be a fellow named Todd Blanche, B-L-A-N-C-H-E. What does a deputy attorney general do? The deputy attorney general is responsible for the day-to-day operation of all these units, kind of the person who is inside the number two in command of any organization. The CEO is the attorney general. There may be a deputy, an assistant CEO. That's this person, takes care of making the trains run, making things work inside the Department of Justice, the day-to-day operation. Right now, that position encumbered by a person named Lisa Monaco. She is outstanding. I had the great honor and opportunity to work with her during the administration of Janet Reno when I was there at Maine Justice. She continues to work in that capacity as being the operational person inside the Department of Justice, right underneath the Attorney General. She has a person to her left, to her right, depending upon how you describe it, called the PAYDAG, the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General. That's important because the president's also announced who he's going to put in that position. That's kind of the chief of staff, if you will, for the Deputy Attorney General. In many ways, because of the great responsibility of the Deputy Attorney General, the PAYDAG, a perhaps unusual way of codifying that term, that acronym, if you will, PADAG. The PAYDAG responsible for supporting the Attorney General, supporting the Deputy Attorney General in doing a lot of the real practical things, in doing what? And managing all sorts of other things, including the Solicitor General's office. The Solicitor General is beneath but responsive to the Deputy Attorney General, and the Attorney General, again, that person who responds to cases in the Supreme Court. We know that there's also an Associate Attorney General inside the Department of Justice, also responding to the deputy. That person involved in things like civil rights and antitrust, all kinds of things. The tax division is underneath the Associate Attorney General. The Office of Settlement Authorities, the Foreign Claims Authority, the Office of International Policy, the offices of all sorts of other things, including the Office on Violence Against Women, the office that implements VAWA. All that is important. The Office of Justice Programs, a hugely important office that administers monies given to communities. We see their work a lot here in Wisconsin as those monies come into various groups that get monies to support justice and support safety and security for people. All of that inside the Office of the Associate Attorney General, including most notably the Civil Rights Division. No small thing inside that as well. And then you've also got the Civil Division, the Environmental Division, the Community Relations Service that, again, engages in community engagements. They're the ones who come into communities at times of crisis and work with communities to try to create peace, maybe not harmony, not complete understanding, but working in parallel to what the Department of Justice does in the courts. Huge amount of responsibility. All of that not only inside the Office of the Associate Attorney General, but ultimately responsible to the deputy, ultimately responsible to the Attorney General, who also has, responding to him, the Office of Legal Counsel, the people who develop that policy, the Office of Public Affairs, the people we see out there in the media describing what the Department of Justice is doing. The Office of Tribal Justice, engaging in our many federally recognized tribes, including 11 of those right here in the state of Wisconsin. The Office of Legislative Affairs, the office that is responsible for engaging appropriately with the Congress when it comes to proposing legislation to affect justice, to promote changes in the law when it needs to happen. All of that also inside the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, responsive to
the Attorney General. And then we have a whole great number of other areas as well. You've got the Office of the Pardon Attorney, responsible for providing, under normal administrations, recommendations to the president about who should be pardoned and who shouldn't under the constitutional authority of the presidency. You've got the Parole Commission. That's also inside the Department of Justice, responding to the deputy and the attorney general, responsible for making decisions and commissioning the parole folks to make decisions about parole ideas. The Office of Immigration Review, the Executive Office of Immigration Review, again, responsible for doing a great variety of things when it comes to immigration issues. The Office of the Inspector General inside the Department of Justice, being a watchdog. These are the whistleblower folks. These are the people who look at the Department of Justice and say, gee, what's going on well, what's going on not so well. The National Security Division, relatively new among the divisions inside the Department of Justice. These are the folks who work with many other agencies, keeping us secure when it comes not only to events like 9/11, but also domestic terrorism. National Security Division, hugely important at a time when we are threatened, both directly and indirectly. We see as well in all of these areas the Criminal Division, your garden variety crimes committed by people, regrettably, in the United States of America. What is the policy and practice about how those crimes should be addressed? How do we implement the criminal code? The Bureau of Prisons is inside the Department of Justice, responsible to the deputy, to the attorney general. The Bureau of Prisons occupying the great majority of the financial support that comes through the Congress to the Department of Justice, keeping our prisons in place, no small controversy. The U.S. Marshal Service, also responsible for not only for keeping our courts secure, keeping officials secure, but also for apprehending fugitives. Interpol, Washington, is also inside the Department of Justice. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, another major agency responsible for all kinds of things with respect to those issues. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, all kinds of agencies, investigative, responsible to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. Why do I talk about all of that? Because it's significant that you understand that the appointment of an Attorney General is not the way it was anymore in 1789. It is now responsible for huge numbers of things that affect quite literally the communities in which you live in all of these areas and more, not just at Main Justice, but in U.S. attorneys' offices and other offices around the nation. When we go into our second hour here on Amicus, we're going to talk about the candidates, the nominees for those positions. And again, as always, taking your inquiries and your questions here as Amicus, a law review, continues on the broadcast stations of Civic Media.
Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus, a law review, the second hour of our weekend broadcast. Glad to have you with me for this second hour. We're spending most of our time this weekend talking about the U.S. Department of Justice, what it does, what its mission is on behalf of you, the people of the United States of America, the role that the Attorney General plays in advancing, promoting, yes, broadly, the missions, the identified goals of the president, but not doing that in a way that identifies particular people, at least not up until now. That has not been the tradition, with, admittedly, a few little glitches here and there. And so we do all of this to help you understand in greater detail and encourage your further exploration of what it is the U.S. Department of Justice does. You can go online, type in the United States Department of Justice, Justice Department, DOJ, it'll all pop up, and you can identify in your particular area of interest specific information about what, for example, the Environment and Natural Resources Division does, what the Antitrust Division does, what the Criminal Division does, what the National Security Division does, what the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, all of them, what do they do inside the Department of Justice? What does the Community-Oriented Policing Services do? What does the Community Relations Service do? What does the Office of Justice Programs do? And why is all of that important? It's because the Attorney General is responsible for overseeing, managing, in many ways directing the operations of all of those various agencies and litigation-specific assignments inside the United States Department of Justice, not just at Main Justice, but also in the U.S. Attorney's offices and other offices in major cities around the country. It is not the case Department of Justice is just out there in Washington, D.C. It's right here in Wisconsin, 2 major offices and lots of other satellite offices when it comes to the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, all these other investigative agencies inside the Department of Justice. And that's why it is so important to understand what the Department of Justice does in concert with appreciating and evaluating, assessing, as we all can and should do, the intended nominees of this president to occupy those positions. We know that just this past week, President-elect Donald Trump named former Representative Matt Gaetz, who has been a Republican representative from the state of Florida, as his nominee for Attorney General. It is undeniably a provocative move. And installing at the helm of the United States Department of Justice somebody who may in fact be the person who accomplishes what Donald Trump has said that he is going to be. And that is retribution, your retribution, my retribution for things that have gone on in America. Those are his words. I'm going to be your retribution, he has said. And maybe, just maybe, that's the commission he's going to be giving to Matt Gaetz. We hope not. We hope that, consistent with the tradition of the Department of Justice, that this Attorney General, if he is confirmed, will adopt and pursue that arm's length relationship and will not be retributive when it comes to who it is who's prosecuted, who it is who is on the receiving end of litigation. The pick undeniably identifies Matt Gaetz. He's 42 years old. He was the focus significantly, as you probably know well, of a 3-year federal investigation by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, the very agencies that he will now oversee, maybe. 2020, at the end of Donald Trump's first term, Justice Department and the FBI opened an investigation to claims that Gaetz, he is a sitting congressman at this time, was involved several years earlier with a minor, a young girl, 17 at the time. Investigators sought to determine whether Gaetz had effectively paid for sex in violation of federal sex trafficking laws. Always have to have a basis upon which to initiate an investigation. They plainly had it here. And they investigated this for about 3 years, ultimately concluding, probably because, reading the tea leaves on this, that for various reasons, the witnesses, including maybe the principal witness, the victim witness here, now well beyond 18, but at the time of making the decision, 18 years old,
probably determining that she would not be a compelling witness, a maybe not even a believable witness when it comes to presenting a case to a grand jury and arguing that the government has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury that would have to decide unanimously that they had met that burden. The Department of Justice determining in the end that perhaps while the events happened, not a sufficiently strong case against Matt Gaetz to bring that to a grand jury to result in a grand jury indictment, to ultimately schedule a trial on those cases. And so never charged them. Matt Gaetz never charged for any of that in the federal system. Gaetz, of course, repeatedly said in the media he did nothing wrong, denied emphatically that any of these charges were true, promised to fight back if indeed there was an indictment. There never was. And so the case itself was not prosecuted formally by the Department of Justice, closed after 3 years, but that's not to say that other things have not happened here. Plainly, Gaetz has also been under investigation by a parallel group. They're not responsible for prosecuting, but that group is the House Ethics Committee. Remember, the House of Representatives subject to ethics oversight by the House Ethics Committee. That about since 2021. That case, House investigators, by all reports, were looking into similar allegations, sexual misconduct, maybe illicit drug abuse and use, all those things, again, in violation of federal law, but just more generally conduct that may be in opposition to the standards set forth for people who are representing us in the United States Congress. Allegations there also about sharing inappropriate images or videos on the House floor. That's a part of the focus, according to a lot of reporting about what the House Ethics Committee has been looking at, arguably misusing some state identification records. Likewise, in his role as a United States representative, converting campaign funds to his personal use, all of those things that may or may not have also been a part of the Department of Justice investigation that resulted in no prosecution. But the subject of parallel investigative work by the House Ethics Committee and its staff. And we know well that the House Ethics Committee was planning to release a critical report on all of that as late as this past Friday. Just this past Friday, announcing that it's going to be having a hearing on Capitol Hill, releasing this report of what it thought would be a sitting member of the House of Representatives, Matt Gaetz. In fact, a couple of days before that, on Wednesday of this past week, as we all know, the president-elect of the United States of America announced that Matt Gaetz would be his nominee for the chief federal law enforcement officer for the United States of America. And almost contemporaneous with that, Matt Gaetz resigned from the House of Representatives, bringing his term of service to the people of Florida to an end there in the United States Congress, effectively under House rules, bringing to an end also the jurisdiction that House Ethics Committee has over him. And so the hearing never happened late this past week. The report was never released. We do not know what it would have said, at least not yet. There have been great calls, as you also know, from the public, from the media, from maybe members of the population generally as well, maybe you among them, calling for the release of this report for a couple of reasons. One, the information generally significant to know, a former government employee whose conduct plainly was the focus of a federal investigation, a criminal investigation, also the focus of an ethics non-criminal. Nobody goes to jail as a result of the House Ethics Committee report. Had it been released, had the committee moved forward on it, they may have sanctioned a member. They may have done other things to tell him, we do not approve, we sanction, we do not condone what you have done, and could apply House rules. None of that involving criminal convictions or time in prison. But there is interest out there in all of this, heightened hugely by the fact that there may be, and certainly appears to be, a huge amount of interest in the other branch, the other chamber of the Congress. That's the United States Senate. Why? Because now, as a result of the announcement of Matt Gaetz as Donald Trump's nominee, now we know that the Senate committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, in addition to the House work in the ethics area, the Senate Judiciary responsible for determining whether or not to recommend the confirmation of Matt Gaetz to the full Senate. The Senate, under its advise and consent responsibility, The Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States of America, also implicit in Article 2, the executive branch, the president nominates, the Senate confirms or not under an advise and consent authority, and planning, presumably, to have that hearing with respect to the nomination of Matt Gaetz. Is it relevant for that Senate committee now to have that report from the House Ethics Committee? I would offer absolutely yes. It is information being held by a group of people literally right down the hall in that same building, the Capitol building of the United States of America. You can walk down the hall from one side of the Senate side of the Congress to the House side, and you can pick up that report plainly. It's in electronic form, can get it easily. Is it relevant for members of the United States Senate determining whether or not this candidate for the position of Attorney General, determining whether or not that candidate is qualified to have that report? That report, that again, is not an indictment. It is a report of the summary of the investigative work done by the House in these various areas. I would argue that it's hugely important. And indeed, senators on both sides of the political aisle are this weekend and previously asking for that report. Significantly, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, his name is Mike Johnson, has said, nope, not giving it to you. The House Ethics Committee work in this area is done. The issue probably not done, probably not resolved. The issue is certainly not going away, especially as the nomination continues to move maybe toward some Senate review. Again, mentioning this notion of a possibility of a recess appointment, which would prevent the Senate from doing its advise and consent process in a routine way. Maybe a story for the coming days to be resolved. But the issue of Matt Gaetz, the nomination of him, and the interplay with his past history, at least suggesting that he may have violated federal law, the very federal laws that he will be obligated to enforce, overseeing agencies that have investigated him, overseeing the very agency that was the recipient of this information about his arguably illegal conduct. We hasten to add, as we always do, no conviction, no finding of guilt here. That happens only if a jury determines guilt beyond a reasonable doubt after a trial, not here, but appropriate, because this process is not a criminal process, it's a political process. And Matt Gaetz should be the subject of Senate review. As Amicus, a law review, continues, we'll talk about the other nominees being presented by the president-elect to the American people and to the Senate for consideration inside the Department of Justice. My name is Jim Santelle. This is Amicus, a law review. Talking today in this special version of Amicus, all about the Department of Justice, interfacing now with these decisions by the president-elect to appoint various people, including Matt Gaetz, to the highest position of law enforcement in our land, the Attorney General position. Matt Gaetz, not a lot, if any, litigation experience, spending most of his time recently in the United States Congress.
Matt Gaetz, the nominee, nonetheless, by the president-elect to occupy this major position, do not have to be present employees of the Department of Justice to be nominated for these positions. It is not the case. You have to rise through the ranks. Many people do. Janet Reno, for example, not a part of the federal Department of Justice, but the attorney general, or rather the district attorney for many years in Florida, Dade County, doing a lot of work there in the area of law enforcement. A prosecutor understands the policies and the principles of a prosecutor, understands litigation, both civil and criminal. And so when Bill Clinton many years ago tapped her to become the attorney general, coming in from the outside, but she knew about the basic processes of the Department of Justice, an active lawyer in court. And so questions plainly beyond his immediate past history, whether or not he qualifies based upon arguably unproven, but nonetheless somewhat evidentiary support for this notion that he was engaging in some kinds of criminal activity, whether that qualifies him or disqualifies Matt Gaetz from being in that position. Other questions about simply your capacity to oversee this huge organization in all these areas that we talked about a couple of segments ago. In that same category, the president-elect has also nominated 3 people in other positions that we've also now just talked about: the deputy attorney general, the principal associate deputy attorney general, the PADAG, kind of the chief of staff for the deputy attorney general, and also the solicitor general of the United States of America, the person sort of fourth in command who charges and goes forward with cases in front of the Supreme Court, argues to the Supreme Court on behalf of the people of the United States of America, the positions adopted by and advanced by the administration. And so who are those other people? Well, the other 3 that the president-elect has nominated are all in the category of people who serve presently as his private attorneys who have represented him, two of them in the criminal cases that are still pending against him, and one of them in other matters as well. Let's talk about them one by one. Todd Blanche, Blanch, a lawyer who oversaw Donald Trump's criminal defense in at least 3 of these criminal indictments, these 3 criminal cases. He's tapped to become the number 2 position in the Department of Justice, the Deputy Attorney General. He is a former prosecutor in Manhattan, so he has that background. He is a trial attorney. He's a defense attorney. And so he's got those kinds of good credentials. He knows what he's doing. He's been inside a courtroom. He has also been, along with another nominee, he's formerly an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York. He has been inside the Department of Justice before for that very reason. And along the way, of course, the history now is that Todd Blanche has represented Donald Trump not only in general matters, but also in that case that is going to take some headlines again this coming week. We know that this coming week on Tuesday, if he keeps to his calendar, Judge Juan Merchan is going to be announcing his decision on whether or not that Supreme Court case involving immunities for a president applies to the criminal prosecution, the criminal conviction that our president-elect suffered way back in May, finding that he violated 34 different instances of New York law. In that matter, Todd Blanche has represented Donald Trump. Now, you may say, well, gee, got a verdict there by a unanimous jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Donald Trump was guilty, but represented him effectively, advocated for his position there in court, and also stood by him as he did those impromptu, or maybe not so impromptu, press conferences outside the Manhattan criminal court. Todd Blanche representing Donald Trump in that case, and presumably will represent him going forward in the days just ahead, not only as Juan Merchan announces his opinion, but also on schedule to sentence Donald Trump, Todd Blanche's client, Donald Trump, on November 26th, right before Thanksgiving. That is also on the schedule. Todd Blanche scheduled to appear with his client, Donald Trump, in those dates coming up here in November. Todd Blanche also named by his client, the future president of the United States of America, to be Donald Trump's deputy attorney general. We'll get back to that in just a moment or so.
The president-elect has also identified a couple of other people. Emile Bove, B-O-V-E, who has also served next to Todd Blanche at those counsel tables in those criminal cases, including the case in New York, in which Donald Trump is found guilty of those New York offenses. He has been nominated. He has been identified as the principal associate deputy attorney general, basically the chief of staff, if you will, to the deputy attorney general, has a huge amount of administrative responsibility inside the Department of Justice, again, for overseeing, managing the department, as does the deputy attorney general. Very important, a right hand, a left hand person right there. Again, according to all of the organizational structure of the Department of Justice historically and anticipated for this administration, anticipating that will happen. Emile Bove, this coming week and next week, sitting next to his client, Donald Trump, in that New York courtroom, as he has done in other settings in which Donald Trump has been charged with criminal offenses, sitting next to his client who will become the president of the United States of America, now indicating that he is going to identify and nominate and place in the position of the paydag the attorney who is in part representing him in those cases. His name, Emile Bove. And then we've got a third one. His name is D. John Sauer, S-A-U-E-R. He has not been representing the president, the future and past president, in connection with these criminal cases, but he did represent Donald Trump before the Supreme Court in arguing what? That the former president was entitled to these broad immunities. And indeed, Mr. Sauer was successful, right, in convincing the Supreme Court that Donald Trump should be immune from prosecution, at least presumptively immune for many things, and absolutely immune for the engagements with the U.S. Department of Justice. John Sauer representing Donald Trump, who is now appointing him to the position of Solicitor General of the United States of America. John Sauer representing him in that case, also representing Donald Trump on the appeal of the E. Jean Carroll sex assault defamation case. That matter now in appeal. He worked for Josh Hawley for many years when Josh Hawley was the attorney general in the state of Missouri. He was also a clerk to Antonin Scalia. All three of these trial attorneys, all three of these people who know their way around the courtroom, all three of them plainly, with respect to some aspects of the cases against Donald Trump, successful. We know that at least those two other cases, the case in Mar-a-Lago, the case involving election interference in the District of Columbia, those will almost certainly go away. Those will not see the light of day. And to the extent that Todd Blanche and Emile Bove and others were responsible for the strategy that promoted the delay in those, they have been successful. And Donald Trump, their future boss as the president, will benefit from that legal counsel, that legal advice for years to come. When we continue, some more discussion about why those issues should be on your mind as we think about the nominees going forward for the Department of Justice here in the United States of America.
This is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, and we are spending most of our time in this weekend broadcast talking about the U.S. Department of Justice and considering the merits, the demerits of the applications, the proposals by the incoming president-elect to place in various positions inside the Department of Justice, positions of great responsibility and authority affecting your life and mine, the lives of everybody that you know. In these positions, various individuals, including Matt Gaetz, the now former representative from Florida, question about whether his qualifications generally require a further review by the United States Senate. The answer to that should be yes, they should definitely review it. Question whether or not they should pass favorably upon that nomination, whether the Senate Judiciary Committee should endorse that, whether the Senate itself should confirm him if indeed that comes to pass. We know that the president has also identified others outside of Main Justice, outside of the Justice Department, Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Pete Hegseth to be the Secretary of Defense, others out there raising similar concerns about whether or not their backgrounds, their recent histories, the things they have said about the very organizations that they will be supervising and the subject matters of those agencies, whether that sort of makes them unqualified or more accurately anti-qualified for those positions. The nomination, the assumed nomination going forward of Matt Gaetz, subject to that important review under the Constitution by the United States Senate, many of them saying already that they may not vote for him, but nonetheless embracing the process. We'll see what happens there. Also embracing the process for Donald Trump's other nominees in those other areas and other positions inside the Department of Justice, including Todd Blanche for the number 2 position, Deputy Attorney General, Emile Beauvais as the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General, and John Sauer to be the Solicitor General, the person who argues cases before the Supreme Court. Now, they are all qualified as lawyers. They're all qualified as prosecutors, some of them obviously inside the Department of Justice. They've practiced in private practice as they do now. They know their way around a courtroom. And indeed, one has to say that Todd Blanche and Emile Beauvais and other members of their team have been successful in representing Donald Trump in at least 2, if not more, of those cases. 2 of those cases, the federal cases, will never see the light of day. They have been successful through the delays that they have accomplished by raising these issues of immunity and other things in keeping Donald Trump from going to trial. Almost certainly one way or another, those cases will go away in the next several weeks. And so successful lawyers, and do not in any way mean to indicate that their aggressive and effective advocacy is something to be critical of. Just the opposite. Defense attorneys are incredibly important to our system. Here's the concern, and is the concern that my former colleague, Barbara McQuaid, who was, when I was U.S. Attorney in Eastern Wisconsin, she was the U.S. Attorney in Detroit in Eastern Michigan. Barbara McQuaid recently said that as to these other 3, it doesn't bode well. It doesn't bode well, and I would embrace that classification as well. 3 reasons why. And again, subject to your own assessment, my opinions, my views, based upon the nominees and the roles that they would play inside the U.S. Department of Justice. Number 1, simply the appearance of awarding your personal private attorneys with great jobs. These are important positions. They're also positions of great notoriety and esteem and regard. For all Americans simply looking at this appears to be a big thank you. I will give you a job inside my administration for keeping me out of prison, for keeping these cases at bay, and on a very superficial but important level, it simply strikes me, and I suspect many people, as simply the appearance of impropriety that a president is now turning around and appointing his attorneys, his private attorneys, to positions inside government because he can, and saying to them, thank you for doing the job well of keeping me out of prison. Now you get a government job. Not nepotism. They're not related to him. This is not like appointing your son-in-law or your daughter to positions inside the White House, but it does have that appearance. And that raises the second issue about the relationship. We know plainly from all the reporting that at least John Blanche and Emile Beauvais and others had to have a very close relationship with Donald Trump during all of this. They also had a close attorney-client relationship
We'll get back to that in just a moment or so. And in that connection, plainly huge amount of communications between them, a relationship undeniably that is legal in nature, that is professional in nature. We don't know if it's personal with a capital P or a small p, but plainly a unique connection between Blanche and Beauvais and the future president of the United States of America. If indeed Donald Trump tends to make good on his promise to engage in retribution, I am your retribution, he has said, it may well be that Matt Gaetz will be the person who accomplishes that generally. The people to whom you call in Washington, D.C., inside Main Justice, if that's your goal, those are the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, the PAYDAG. It's these various people who have had this very close relationship with Donald Trump during the time of their representation of him in these various settings. Those are the people that the president calls, picks up the phone and says, do this. And in so doing, abrogates and destroys what we have talked about previously here this weekend and so many other times, abrogates that arm's length relationship. The fact that they have had this relationship, continue to have it to this day, presumably into next week and the weeks ahead as the sentencing goes ahead in New York, other things happen with respect to those criminal cases. That relationship is so close that one wonders if the arm's length relationship that should be established between the White House and the Department of Justice could in any way exist when they already have a very close personal relationship. I always speak about the non-relationship that Bill Clinton had with Janet Reno. They didn't like each other very much, and that was a good thing. Here you've got just the opposite. Is it too close for the connection, the arm's length connection, admittedly, but the connection between the White House and the Department of Justice to be appropriate, and not to encourage the kinds of directives that a president could do with respect to specific kinds of prosecutions against rivals, specific people filing civil lawsuits against them, no separation of just a relationship nature. That's the second reason why my colleague and I, Barbara Quaid, say this doesn't bode well. And the third one is kind of wonky. And it's really inside that representation issue. And we don't know a lot about, we will never know anything about the nature of the communications between Donald Trump and his attorney. But we do know that there was an attorney-client relationship there. We know with absolute certainty that Donald Trump, protected by the attorney-client relationship now and for all time, unless there is some rare exception, some crime fraud exception that breaks into it, but unlikely here. Unlikely. We know that Donald Trump told his attorneys, Todd Blanche, Mr. Beauvais, others in his team, things of a confidential nature. We don't know what those are. We don't know if they were admissions. We don't know if they were denials. We don't know what kinds of things he may have said about things related to the case in New York, those other cases in South Florida, the other case in Washington, D.C., the interference case. We don't know the content. We don't know what kinds of things the present and future and past president may have said to his attorneys, cloaked by, shielded by the attorney-client privilege, never to be disclosed. But they know things. They plainly know things about the man, the individual who's going to be occupying the West Wing and the White House and the Oval Office in particular. What if Donald Trump disclosed to them something in that confidential relationship? We don't know what. Wildly speculative on my part. I recognize that somehow becomes relevant, somehow becomes important to their work. Now, not as is counsel, but as operational people responsible for the Department of Justice, as the heads of the Department of Justice representing you, representing the people, no longer the person who's occupying the presidency, their former client. What if they know something that at some point becomes relevant? What if the president says or does something that prompts them to remember something that they told him, that he told them, in the context of that attorney-client relationship that presents maybe, possibly a conflict of interest that probably only they will know about? Something the president does that they look at and say, gee, that's different from what he told us in the client relationship. That's contrary to what we know about what he admitted to us, what he said to us, what he confided us while we were his attorneys. And then they have a conflict of interest. The conflict is just that they cannot disclose that. And at the same time, they're responsible to represent what? Your interests, the interests of the Department of Justice, the interests of the rule of law, and cannot disclose the things that they know could be important to the administration of the Department of Justice. That's the concern. That's the not bode well part of this. Again, wildly speculative, but that's the kind of thing that the members of the Senate, members of the population at large, should be looking at in determining whether or not even these folks, the other three, are they qualified as lawyers? Sure they are. They've been prosecutors. They've been inside courtrooms. They've argued cases to the Supreme Court. Sauer himself knows well the inside and outside of the Supreme Court. Is he qualified to take on the role that Ted Olson took on during the Bush administration? That Elizabeth Prelogar right now is doing so exceptionally well? Of course he is. The question is whether that appointment raises these concerns about appearances that you have of an incoming president appointing his former defense attorneys, the attorneys who've represented him in these appellate proceedings. Does that strike you as problematic? And I would suggest to you that it should. And certainly should suggest to the members of the Senate who are looking at this that they need to ask questions, not breaching the attorney-client relationship. That would be inappropriate. But nonetheless, inquiring about whether or not that's a concern, not disclosing the information, but concern among these nominees. Very clear, of course, anticipating a question here that none of these attorneys can continue to represent the sitting president in his private capacity once they become and they encumber these various positions like Deputy Attorney General, like the PAYDAG, like Solicitor General. They cannot continue to represent him in any matters that may continue during his presidency, including those state cases, those state criminal matters in Georgia, and certainly in New York, as that goes up on appeal very likely. Cannot do that. No one would permit that to happen. The president might like them to do so because they've been successful in accomplishing what he wanted them to do, but that cannot happen. But the issue is that prior representation. And with respect to Matt Gaetz, it is the prior investigative results not resulting in an indictment. The other information that's inside that report, all of that should come to the Senate Judiciary Committee in the times just ahead. They should conduct their hearings. They should not approve any of these people, including for many of the other positions for assistant attorneys general around the Department of Justice. No U.S. attorneys appointed by recess appointments, absent a review in some ways, big or small, by the Senate Judiciary Committee. We've got to approach this in the ways that James Madison contemplated we would do it, advise and consent of the Senate. That's the way that should happen. The American people should push back on this notion that recess appointments should be accomplished in a way that robs the United States Senate of the capacity to ask these questions of the Matt Gaetzes of the world, of the Tulsi Gabbards, of the RFK Juniors, of the Pete Hegseths, and of the many other nominees, thousands of them, candidly, that are going to come before the Congress for approval or rejection in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. All of that happening, of course, as we anticipate the coming time. We have talked at great length about the nominations and the Department of Justice. We have also talked about the Supreme Court and the connection between the office of the Solicitor General and the Supreme Court. The fact that there is indeed going to be a change in that position, whether or not John Sauer is confirmed, there will be a change in administration and a change in the ways in which the Department of Justice, through that office of the Solicitor General, advocates before the Supreme Court. We're going to talk more about the effects of a new Solicitor General, a new administration, upon the present term that has before it a great number of cases, 45 as of this weekend, in a great number of areas, environmental cases, commerce cases. There's that major transgender case coming up for argument in December. We have also already had the argument involving firearms in America, the case involving the future of an ATF regulation. As we continue, we'll talk more about that and also other cases involving the United States Supreme Court here on Amicus, a law review.
This is Amicus, a law review, as always, inviting your questions and your inquiries into our discussion this weekend, no exception to that. Mark, you've been on the line for a long time. Glad to have you with us this weekend on Amicus. Your question, your comment, your observation.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that Donald Trump, is going out for retribution now, and clearly thinking about it logically. If indeed the Biden administration had been going after Donald Trump in retributive fashion, Donald Trump would be in jail right now. I mean, if he would have unleashed the full power of law enforcement upon Donald Trump and his allies, they would currently be in jail or detained someplace unpleasant. What is remarkable to me is that Donald Trump supporters are going full along with one of the things that we broke with England for, is that basically under English Code of Justice, I mean, the king just said, "Judges, do this for me," and it was done. I mean, they served at the king's pleasure. That corruption in office has been anathema to justice or to government going back to antiquity. I mean, the story I've mentioned before is the case of Ximenes and Cambrus II. When Cambrus II found out that his judge Ximenes was taking bribes, he had the man executed in a most unpleasant fashion. That how a Supreme Court, the sophistry that they've engaged in to allow, calling bribes now they're gratuities, and to say that a president is immune when clearly the founders they rejected the idea of presidential immunity wholeheartedly, because that was one of the fears that the anti-federalists proposed, that they would just establish a monarchy here, and we cannot have that.
Absolutely. That's the key. And frankly, as you know well, Mark, that's exactly what at least the dissenters in that immunity case said. Sonia Sotomayor saying, again, we've got a loaded gun sitting there in the Oval Office ready to go off. And arguably, again, she wasn't speaking about the specific physical use of a weapon, although she did present some options now that a president would have as the king, some of which you have made reference to historically. She ended her piece saying, "I'm fearful for democracy." And I take from your comments this weekend that's your concern as well. And so, Mark, appreciate very much the comments and the historical perspective, which again prompt us all to think about the incoming administration, how it's going to handle these newfound powers, and specifically through the people put in positions of responsibility. Mentioned before, of course, that the Solicitor General is one of those people going to be encumbering the office of the Solicitor General inside the Department of Justice. Why is that important? The position of Solicitor General not only argues, but also articulates in memorandums and briefs positions of the administration. There are two cases pending right now before the Supreme Court that will almost certainly be changed in the 65 days or maybe 70 days or so yet ahead, 65 days before Donald Trump takes the oath of office, and presumably some of these folks move through the process. One of those cases called Scrimetti. It's a transgender rights case. It's a challenge brought by the Biden administration to a Tennessee law that bans medical treatments for transgender minors. Scheduled to be argued right now, still in December next month. And the law also challenged in a separate lawsuit by families and a doctor. The justices granted only the Biden administration's petition in that case to be reviewed. Trump administration, with the new Solicitor General coming in, will almost certainly reverse course. And the court will sooner or later have to make adjustments if it decides the constitutionality of the law, a dramatic impact upon one of the major cases of this term based upon what the American people have decided, the change in the Solicitor General then that comes from that, and a change in the advocacy about transgender rights in America. Here's the other one that we've talked about. We have talked about this case called Garland versus Vanderstock. It's the case on ghost guns, argued in October. The Supreme Court seemingly awfully supportive of the ATF regulation that says, yep, we can regulate these things. You can get them through the mail, you can order them, and you can put them together. Yes, it's appropriate to have serial numbers on them. Appears that the Supreme Court was headed in the direction, haven't decided it yet, of supporting the DEA regulation that permits regulations of ghost guns and the manufacturers of that. Trump administration could remember that moot, rescinding the regulation, changing the very underpinnings for the case itself,
And of course, that would change the geography, not only of firearms in America, but the advocacy that goes on there in the Supreme Court. Many, many other instances, 45 other cases right now pending in front of the Supreme Court as of this week. Not all of them involve government interests, but many of them do. They just this past week granted certiorari in a number of other cases, things important to know, cases involving environmental issues. Oklahoma versus EPA, originating from the 10th Circuit, concerns whether the EPA has its final action under the Clean Air Act, where you challenge that kind of thing. Another case, EPA versus Calumet Shreveport Refining, concerns whether the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia must be the venue for the claims of a small oil refinery. Some challenges there. Both of those things happening with respect to environmental cases. The Clean Air Act implicated by that, a thing called the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. Those cases are pending before the Supreme Court right now. They are newly welcomed, if you will, into the group of cases the Supreme Court will decide. All of those, like many others, are also cases in which the government has taken positions in favor of the EPA rules and the EPA positions. Will the new Solicitor General coming in about 65 days or so, or maybe shortly thereafter, reverse the positions of the present administration and abandon the EPA's position in favor of clean air and clean water and all the other environmental cases? A case recently given cert again in the Supreme Court called Louisiana versus Calais concerns the congressional map that the Louisiana legislature adopted in 2024. Now, that case probably not involving the federal government, but nonetheless, a case where if there is a related interest of the Department of Justice, of the government generally, we have seen this in all of the other gerrymandering cases, right? Many other situations where the U.S. Department of Justice has weighed in on these kinds of things. Many other cases out there. Cases argued just this past week. Velazquez versus Garland, having to do with, again, an immigration issues, involuntary departure of immigrants under our federal system. A case called Delegati, which was also argued just this past week, involving minimum mandatory prison sentences. That's in a case involving the government centrally. The Solicitor General involved directly in that case, arguing before the Supreme Court just this past week. And another case involving securities fraud, likewise of just this past week. All of those cases implicating the U.S. Department of Justice in deciding the positions of the Department of Justice. As we continue next week and in the weekends ahead, more discussion, more analysis of all of these things, going to the rule of law, going to courts, and going to the administration of justice in our nation in 2024, 2025, and the times ahead. Have a good weekend, everybody.